Sometimes, the moment a woman has the entire room turned against her is the exact second she knows she has won. At our 9th anniversary party, I did not cry or argue when my sister-in-law publicly branded me a cheater. I simply looked at my husband, then the television, and smiled. Vanessa's supposed killing blow was actually the final trapdoor opening to expose a massive conspiracy of greed and family betrayal no one saw coming. My name is Lucy Hughes. I am 35 years old, and my entire professional life is built on anticipating disasters long before they have the chance to happen. Living in the affluent, meticulously manicured suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina, I serve as the Director of Risk Review at Northglenn Civic Strategies. It is a title that sounds terribly dry to most people outside of the corporate sphere, but in practice, it means I am highly trained to look at a perfectly constructed facade and immediately identify the microscopic hairline fractures. I am the person who finds the missing funds neatly buried under layers of corporate jargon, the hidden liabilities masked as assets, and the quiet, desperate little lies people tell on paper to save their own skins. I see the patterns that others willfully ignore. It is an incredibly lucrative skill in the world of high-stakes consulting. However, it is a profoundly isolating and heavy burden when you cannot help but apply that same analytical lens to your own family. Tonight was supposed to be a sanctuary from all of that. My husband, Ethan, and I were hosting our 9th wedding anniversary party at our sprawling home. We had invited a carefully curated list of guests, consisting of our closest friends, extended relatives, and a few of the most trusted, long-standing business partners of the Hughes family empire. From a purely aesthetic standpoint, the first 2 hours of the evening were absolutely flawless. Soft, instrumental jazz drifted effortlessly through the high, vaulted ceilings of our living room, mingling pleasantly with the muted, sophisticated laughter and the sharp clinking of heavy crystal wine glasses. The ambient lighting was set to a warm, forgiving amber, casting a golden hour glow over the towering floral arrangements and the intricate 3-tier vanilla bean cake resting proudly on the mahogany dining table. Waiters drifted silently through the crowd, pouring expensive wine. People held their glasses high, offering smiles and toasts that felt, at least on the surface, incredibly genuine. Ethan was completely in his element. He stood near the grand stone fireplace, a heavy glass of bourbon loosely gripped in his right hand, laughing heartily at a long-winded story being told by his uncle. His handsome face was relaxed, flushed with genuine joy, and the simple comfort of being surrounded by the people he loved most in the world. Ethan is a man who implicitly trusts the universe to be good. He believes the best of people, a trait I have always deeply admired, yet secretly feared, because it leaves his flanks completely exposed to those who do not play by the same honorable rules. Then, there was Vanessa. Ethan's younger sister moved through our living room not like a gracious guest enjoying a family milestone, but like a lead stage actor waiting impatiently for her lighting cue. She was dressed entirely too loudly for an intimate home gathering. She wore a backless, emerald green silk gown that clung to her frame and commanded immediate attention the second she stepped into any room. I stood quietly near the kitchen island and simply watched her. I watched her glide from cluster to cluster of guests, her smile sharp and practiced, her eyes darting constantly and nervously toward the center of the room, toward the cake, and invariably, toward me. She was vibrating with a nervous, electric energy that she was failing miserably to conceal. She looked like someone holding a winning lottery ticket, terrified of losing it before she could cash it in. For 9 long years, Vanessa and I had maintained a highly fragile, exhausting ecosystem of superficial politeness. We exchanged expensive, entirely impersonal gifts during the holidays and offered tight-lipped, closed-mouth smiles at mandatory Sunday family dinners. But beneath that polite, glossy veneer, there was a deep, rotting resentment that had been festering since the day Ethan proposed to me. Vanessa had never truly accepted me into the Hughes fold. To her, I was an outsider, a cold, calculating professional who did not understand the unspoken, messy rules of their family legacy. She had once complained to Ethan that I was entirely incapable of warmth. She told him, loud enough for me to hear from the hallway, that I had coldly turned their family dynamic into an endless, sterile audit. She despised the fact that I looked at the world through a lens of strict accountability, mostly because Vanessa was a woman who had lived her entire adult life running desperately from the consequences of her own actions. As the clock ticked past 9:30, the highly trained risk assessor inside my brain began to involuntarily log a series of alarming anomalies. The warm, celebratory atmosphere in the room was beginning to curdle and turn sour. I walked toward the hallway, and as I passed a small group of Ethan's cousins huddled near the staircase, their hushed conversation abruptly died in their throats. They turned to look at me, and their expressions were a strange, toxic cocktail of pity, morbid curiosity, and poorly concealed judgment. It was the specific, haunting kind of look people give you when they have just been handed a terrible, scandalous secret about your life, a secret that you do not yet possess yourself. It was not just the cousins. Diane, my mother-in-law, had been sitting unusually rigid on the velvet armchair for the last 45 minutes, gripping the stem of her wine glass so tightly I thought the crystal might shatter. She had actively avoided making eye contact with me all night, staring blankly out at the dark front lawn whenever I drifted into her line of sight. I stopped at the edge of the living room and scanned the crowd again. The actual geometry of the party had physically shifted while I was not looking. People were subtly positioning themselves, forming a wide, invisible perimeter around the central dining table where the cake sat. Ethan remained entirely oblivious to the changing tides. He was now clapping a senior business partner on the shoulder, laughing at a joke, completely blind to the silent, vibrating frequency of tension humming through our home. But I felt it in my bones. The rhythm of the room was fundamentally wrong. The air had grown thick and heavy. It was the suffocating barometric pressure drop that happens right before a violent, destructive thunderstorm tears through a quiet town. It was exactly 10 o'clock. The hired caterers began to quietly clear the empty appetizer plates, signaling the transition to the dessert portion of the evening and the highly anticipated formal toasts. Ethan finally caught my eye from across the expansive room, beaming with pure affection, and gestured enthusiastically toward the 3-tier cake. It was time. As I slowly walked across the hardwood floor to join my husband, the soft, ambient jazz music was deliberately muted by someone standing near the sound system. The sudden silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavy, jagged, and deafening. The guests began to circle around the mahogany dining table, but they stood just a little too far back, leaving Ethan and me entirely isolated in the center, like two targets illuminated by a spotlight. Vanessa eagerly pushed her way to the absolute front of the crowd, the emerald silk of her dress catching the amber light. There was a raw, predatory gleam in her eyes, a look of pure, unadulterated anticipation. I looked at the dozens of faces surrounding us in our own home. The polite, celebratory smiles had entirely vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable, breathless tension. People were holding their breath. A cold, absolute realization washed over me, settling like a heavy stone in the pit of my stomach. As I looked at the sea of eyes fixed intensely upon me, I knew with chilling certainty that tonight was no longer a celebration of 9 years of marriage. I was walking blindly into a public tribunal, and the executioner was already standing there, holding the blade, waiting for the audience to quiet down before she struck. Ethan cleared his throat, tapping his spoon gently against the rim of his crystal glass. The bright ringing sound cut through the heavy, stagnant air of the living room. He wrapped his left arm securely around my shoulders, pulling me close against his side. The warmth of his body was reassuring, a familiar anchor in a room that felt increasingly unmoored. He smiled, looking around at the gathered crowd of relatives and colleagues. He opened his mouth to speak, to deliver the heartfelt toast I knew he had been practicing in his head for the last 3 days. He was going to talk about trust. He always talked about trust. But before a single syllable could leave his lips, Vanessa stepped forward. She did not just walk. She thrust herself violently into the center of the ring, positioned directly opposite us across the massive cake. She raised her own glass of red wine high into the air, the dark liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. threatening to stain the pristine white tablecloth. "Wait," Vanessa announced, her voice pitched loud and sharp, slicing through the polite silence of the room like a serrated blade. "Before we raise a glass to 9 years of marital bliss, I think everyone here deserves to know the actual truth about Lucy." The sudden silence that slammed into the room was absolute. It was the kind of total, suffocating quiet that follows a car crash. Right before the screaming begins, for one agonizing second, nobody breathed. The guests stood paralyzed, wine glasses suspended halfway to their mouths. Then, the bizarre modern reflex of our era kicked in. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. 3 of Ethan's younger cousins simultaneously reached into their pockets and purses. The dim glow of smartphone screens illuminated their faces as they hit record, instinctively capturing what they assumed would be nothing more than a messy, drunken family meltdown. They wanted front-row seats to the drama. They wanted a video to circulate in their private group chats by midnight. Vanessa did not lower her glass. Her eyes, wide and practically vibrating with malicious adrenaline, locked onto mine. There was a desperate, almost feral joy in her expression. "You all think she is this perfect, devoted wife," she continued, her volume increasing, making sure her voice reached the very back of the living room where the business partners stood. "You think she is the savior of the Hughes family. Always so calculating, always so correct. You hand her the keys to the kingdom because she looks good on paper. But she has been lying to Ethan. She has been lying to all of us." Ethan tightened his grip on my shoulder. His fingers dug slightly into my collarbone. "Vanessa, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice low, laced with profound confusion rather than anger. He was still trying to protect her, trying to give her an out. "Put the glass down. You have had too much to drink. You are embarrassing yourself. I am perfectly sober." "Ethan," she snapped back, her gaze snapping to her brother. The viciousness in her tone made him flinch physically. "I am just the only one brave enough to tell you that your wife has been sleeping with another man for months." The collective gasp from the room was entirely audible. It sounded like the air being sucked out of an airlock. A sudden, violent murmur rippled through the crowd of guests. The older generation clutched their pearls, both literally and figuratively, while the younger ones leaned in closer, hungry for the carnage. "His name is Gavin Pike." Vanessa spat the name out as if it were poison on her tongue, making sure to enunciate every single syllable so the business associates in the back could hear. "And she has been carrying on a disgusting, secret affair with him right under your nose." She slammed her wine glass down onto the table, the base hitting the mahogany with a violent thud that sloshed red wine over the delicate white lace runner. She practically tore her smartphone out of her clutch purse. Her thumbs flew across the screen, jabbing at the glass before she shoved the bright display outward, holding it up like a holy relic for the closest guests to see. "I have the proof," she declared triumphantly, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I have the text messages. I have her private calendar appointments. I have the photographs." She began pacing in a tight semicircle, aggressively pushing the screen into the personal space of our aunts, uncles, and Ethan's senior partners. She was making sure the poison spread evenly. "Look at this," she commanded, practically shoving the phone into the face of a corporate vice president. "Read it yourself. This is a text she sent him last Tuesday at 11 o'clock at night. As she calls him, and I quote, 'the only person I can talk to in private.' Does that sound like a professional colleague to you? Does that sound like a woman talking to a casual acquaintance about a risk assessment?" She swiped her finger aggressively across the screen. "And look at this one. Look at where she goes when she tells you she is working late at the office." Ethan, I did not need to see the screen to know exactly what image she was displaying. It was a photograph of me, captured under the dim, amber streetlights, walking alone through the ornate brass doors of the downtown boutique hotel. In the twisted, fabricated context she was forcefully creating, the image looked incredibly damning. I looked exactly like a woman creeping through the shadows, slipping away into the cold night for a clandestine hotel rendezvous. The framing was impeccable. If I had not known the truth, I would have condemned myself based on that single image. The whispering surrounding us escalated from a low, shocked hum to a frantic, buzzing swarm. I heard the sharp intake of breath from Diane, my mother-in-law. I slowly shifted my gaze toward her. She sat completely frozen in her velvet chair, her face drained of all color, her hand tightly covering her mouth. She looked utterly horrified, but she did not stand up. She did not yell at her daughter to stop this madness. She did not order the guests to put their phones away. She offered absolutely no defense on my behalf. She just sat there, consuming the humiliation being poured over my head, utterly silent, choosing the safety of inaction over the messy work of defending her daughter-in-law. But the true devastation, the real, bone-crushing agony, did not come from Vanessa's screaming or the judgmental stares of the guests or even Diane's cowardly silence. It came from the man standing right beside me. Ethan did not shout. He did not lunge across the table to grab the phone from his sister's hands. He simply stopped breathing. I felt the exact, horrifying moment. The shock hit his nervous system and bypassed his heart entirely. The warmth radiating from his body seemed to instantly freeze, turning him to stone, and then, slowly, agonizingly, the heavy weight of his arm lifted. His hand, which had been anchoring me, protecting me just moments before, slipped away from my shoulder. It dropped limply to his side. That small, almost imperceptible gesture tore a gaping hole straight through my chest. The physical separation was a deafening declaration of doubt. In that fraction of a second, the foul seed of betrayal had been successfully planted in his mind, and its toxic roots were already tearing into our 9 years of unwavering trust. The pain of his hand leaving my shoulder was infinitely sharper than any weapon Vanessa could have ever wielded. He did not ask if it was true. He just let go. The entire room was waiting for me to break. They were vibrating with the anticipation of a messy, spectacular collapse. They were waiting for the desperate tears, the frantic, trembling denials, the ugly screaming match that would validate the hideous spectacle Vanessa had just orchestrated. Vanessa stood there, her chest heaving heavily, a twisted, victorious smirk slowly stretching across her face. She looked at me with the absolute certainty of a predator that had finally cornered a trapped animal. She thought she had drawn blood. She thought she had delivered the fatal, finishing blow. I took a slow, deliberate breath, drawing the air deep into my lungs. I felt the cold, hard, familiar edges of my professional training slide perfectly into place, heavy iron doors locking my emotions safely behind a steel vault. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford when you are standing in a burning building. I looked down at my right hand. My fingers were still wrapped tightly around the ornate silver handle of the cake knife. I did not throw it. I did not point it in her direction. I very carefully, very silently, placed the silver blade down onto the pristine white tablecloth. The faint, metallic click of the steel against the table seemed to echo like a gunshot in the sudden, tense silence of the room. I slowly lifted my chin and looked directly into Vanessa's manic, expectant eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single word of panicked explanation to Ethan or the gaping crowd recording my every move. I kept my tone entirely flat, entirely composed, and absolutely glacial. The kind of tone that makes the air temperature drop. "If you want everyone to see," I said, the words slipping out with terrifying calm, "then tonight they will see everything." "Put the phone away, Vanessa," I said. My voice was completely devoid of the panic she was so desperately trying to mine from me. The instruction was delivered with the exact same cadence I used to halt a board meeting when I found a severe discrepancy in a quarterly financial report. The crowd, firmly expecting a tearful breakdown or a chaotic screaming match, fell into a profoundly confused, breathless hush. It is incredibly selfish to force our guests to squint at a 6-inch piece of glass. I continued, gesturing smoothly toward the massive 85-inch flat-screen television mounted above the marble fireplace. If you have gone through the immense, tedious trouble of compiling a digital dossier to destroy my life, let us at least give your presentation the production value it rightfully deserves. Cast it to the screen. Let everyone in the room read the evidence clearly. Vanessa blinked. Her triumphant sneer faltered for a fraction of a second, quickly replaced by a flash of genuine bewilderment. She had undoubtedly anticipated a dozen different reactions from me: frantic denial, pathetic begging, unhinged fury, but she had absolutely not prepared for an open invitation to broadcast her poison. Then, the sneer returned, setting harder and sharper on her features than before. She smiled, a cold, predatory stretching of her lips. She genuinely believed I was unraveling myself in public, completely undone by the sheer shock of being exposed. "Gladly," she hissed, her fingers swiping briskly down her phone screen. "Ethan," I said, not looking at him, my eyes remaining fixed on his sister. "Turn on the television, please. Switch the input to the wireless display." My husband moved like a sleepwalker. Without a single word, without even glancing in my direction, he reached out and picked up the heavy metal remote control resting on the edge of the coffee table. The mechanical, hollow nature of his compliance was heartbreaking, a clear sign that his brain was completely overloaded by trauma, but I ruthlessly compartmentalized that pain. I locked it away in a dark, quiet place in my mind. Right now, I could not afford to be a wounded wife. I needed to control the room. The massive screen flared to life, casting a harsh, artificial blue glare over the terrified, expectant faces of our guests. A second later, Vanessa's phone screen was mirrored perfectly across 85 inches of high-definition glass. The gasps from the crowd rippled through the air again, louder this time, as the sheer scale of the projection made the accusation impossible to ignore. There it was, towering over us. A violently cropped screenshot of a text message thread. The name Gavin Pike sat at the very top in bold, black letters. Below it, a single text bubble, sent from my number, glared out at the room. "You are the only person I can talk to in private." With a rapid swipe of her thumb, Vanessa changed the slide. Now, the screen displayed the photograph. Blown up to this massive size, the heavy graininess of the digital zoom was entirely obvious, but the subject matter remained damning. It was me, walking alone into the dimly lit lobby of a boutique hotel. Another swipe, and a calendar entry appeared, dominating the screen. It was titled "Off-Site Meeting. Do Not Disturb," and it was firmly scheduled for 8 o'clock in the evening. The murmurs in the living room intensified, a rising tide of judgment and whispered condemnations, but I did not rush the screen. I did not scramble to frantically explain away the pixels that were currently incinerating my reputation in real time. I stood perfectly still. I let the images hang there, allowing the heavy, intensely uncomfortable silence to stretch and pull until the guests began to shift awkwardly on their feet, the initial thrill of the scandal slowly souring into deep unease. When the tension reached its absolute, unbearable peak, I finally spoke. I did not address the photographs. I did not address the text messages. I certainly did not address Gavin Pike. I addressed the architect of the moment. "Why tonight, Vanessa?" I asked. It was a short, brutally simple question, dropped straight into the center of the room like a heavy stone into a pool of still water. Vanessa scoffed. A short, ugly, abrasive sound that echoed unpleasantly in the cavernous space. She threw her arms wide, playing shamelessly to her captive audience. "Because it is your anniversary. Because Ethan was about to stand up here and give a heartfelt speech about his wonderful, loyal wife. He deserves to know the absolute truth before he makes a complete fool of himself praising a liar." It was a very good performance. It sounded passionate. It sounded fiercely righteous. But I had spent my entire professional career sitting across wide mahogany tables from liars, trained to watch for the microscopic, involuntary muscle movements that betray a fabricated narrative. I watched her eyes. As she delivered her righteous, sisterly justification, her gaze darted away from mine for exactly 1 second. It was a microscopic flicker of instability, a tiny, fleeting tell that revealed the massive, frantic calculation happening rapidly behind her forehead. She was not acting out of a noble, deep-seated desire to protect her older brother. She was operating on a strict, terrifying deadline. "That is a very moving sentiment," I replied, my voice smooth, unyielding, and entirely stripped of any emotional inflection. "But it is functionally incorrect. You did not choose tonight because of the anniversary. You chose tonight because of tomorrow morning." The nature of the confusion in the room violently shifted. The morbid, salacious fascination with my alleged infidelity was suddenly and sharply undercut by a cold jolt of corporate reality. Several of the senior partners and financial advisors standing near the back of the room stopped whispering. They stood a little straighter, their eyes narrowed, locking on to me. I had just stopped speaking the language of domestic drama and started speaking the language of money. "Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I continued, deliberately projecting my voice so it reached every single corner of the sprawling living room. "The Hughes family is scheduled to sit down in the primary boardroom downtown. We are scheduled to finalize the commercial real estate redevelopment deal for Hughes Meridian Development. It is the largest single acquisition this family has attempted in 14 years. It involves tens of millions of dollars in highly leveraged assets and an incredibly complex web of municipal zoning approvals." Vanessa's jaw tightened so hard, I thought I might hear her teeth crack. The expensive emerald silk of her dress seemed to lose some of its vibrant shimmer as her posture went completely rigid. She gripped her smartphone tighter, her knuckles instantly turning bone white. She opened her mouth to interrupt, to scream over me, but I raised my hand. It was a single, sharp, authoritative gesture that demanded and received total silence. "As everyone in this room intimately connected to the family business is well aware," I said, sweeping my calm gaze across the faces of Ethan's uncles and the sharp-suited legal advisors who had been enjoying our expensive wine just minutes ago. "My firm was explicitly brought in to conduct the independent risk assessment on that specific, high-stakes acquisition. I am the lead director on the file. And according to the binding financial covenants drafted by the lending consortium, the capital cannot be released, and the deal cannot be legally closed, without my final, unencumbered signature of approval." I paused, letting that heavy, undeniable fact settle over the crowd. The atmospheric pressure in the living room shifted fundamentally. The narrative Vanessa had so carefully and maliciously constructed, the tragic, scandalous tale of a blindly betrayed husband and a cruel, cheating wife, was suddenly fracturing. The glossy, dramatic veneer was peeling back, revealing the cold, hard, unforgiving steel of a corporate assassination underneath. "If I am exposed as a liar tonight," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, conversational murmur that forced every person in the room to lean forward to hear me. "If my professional and personal credibility is publicly annihilated in front of the very stakeholders who require my objective oversight, then anything I say tomorrow morning is instantly rendered invalid. My signature becomes utterly worthless. My risk assessment becomes instantly tainted by personal scandal." I took 3 slow, highly measured steps toward Vanessa. She held her ground, but her chin tilted up defensively. She suddenly looked less like a victorious hunter, and much more like an animal realizing the trap it thought it had set was actually a steel cage rapidly closing in around it. "So," I concluded, staring directly into the sudden, sharp, panicked realization swimming desperately in her eyes, "let us be entirely honest with our guests. This is not a theatrical display of sisterly devotion. This is a highly calculated, desperate tactical strike aimed squarely at my professional authority, executed precisely 11 hours before I am required to approve a financial transaction you desperately need to push through." The silence that followed was no longer the silence of shock or secondhand embarrassment. It was the heavy, calculating silence of a room full of intelligent, powerful people furiously doing the math in their heads, and realizing that the numbers Vanessa had given them did not add up. The foundation for this exact moment of reckoning was quietly poured exactly 4 months ago. It did not begin with a dramatic public confrontation or a shattered wine glass, but rather with a deeply exhausted sigh in a heavily wood-paneled office. Robert Hughes, the patriarch who had spent the last 4 decades building the family corporate empire stone by stone, had called me into his private workspace on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He looked significantly older that day, the sharp, authoritative lines of his usually commanding face softened by a creeping, undeniable anxiety. The company was preparing to enter the preliminary, highly sensitive stages of the massive real estate redevelopment deal, a venture carrying a staggering amount of leveraged, institutional risk. Robert, possessing the sharp, intuitive survival instincts of a self-made man, felt a persistent, nagging itch at the base of his skull regarding their internal cash flow. He did not suspect deliberate malice from his own flesh and blood. Not yet. He simply asked me, strictly off the official books and as a personal, quiet favor, to run a diagnostic audit on their operational expenditures over the past 3 fiscal quarters. I agreed without hesitation. For the next 3 weeks, I spent my late evenings sitting alone at my long dining room table, bathing in the cold, harsh blue light of my laptop screen, slowly pulling apart the dense, tangled yarn of the corporate general ledger. To an untrained, casual observer, a massive corporate expense report is just a blinding blizzard of black ink, sterile categories, and endless rows of meaningless data. But to me, a financial ledger is a living, breathing narrative. Numbers do not possess the capacity to lie, but they are frequently manipulated by desperate people to tell highly creative works of fiction. You just have to know exactly how to read the negative space left behind. It took exactly 11 days of granular, line-by-line reading before I found the first ghost hiding in the machine. It was a seemingly innocuous line item, buried deep within the bloated marketing and promotional budget. The payment was routed to a third-party vendor named Cedar Lane Staging. The name sounded perfectly legitimate, the exact kind of bland, inoffensive corporate entity you would expect a firm to hire for setting up a promotional gala. But when I attempted to cross-reference their service history and tax identification, the trail evaporated into thin air. There was no physical commercial address on file, only a rented post office box located in a dilapidated strip mall 2 towns over. There was no functional website, no public portfolio of past events, and the registered agent on the limited liability company charter was a generic, bulk corporate processing firm. My professional curiosity immediately sharpened into high alert. I began running highly targeted database queries, specifically hunting for that exact structural anomaly across the rest of the ledger. Within 2 hours, I unearthed 2 more identical ghosts, Blue Harbor Design Services and Ashmere Event Logistics. They shared the exact same digital emptiness as Cedar Lane. They were completely hollow shells, existing entirely on paper, yet they were quietly siphoning significant, steady streams of capital out of the family business. The true, insidious artistry, however, lay not in the fake corporate names, but in the precise mathematical calibration of the theft. In the Hughes corporate governance structure, any single vendor payment exceeding $50,000 required a mandatory secondary authorization signature from a senior executive, which usually meant Robert or Ethan. It was a standard, sturdy financial safeguard designed to prevent massive embezzlement. Every single invoice submitted by Cedar Lane, Blue Harbor, and Ashmere was meticulously calculated to sit just millimeters below that protective wire. I found a payment for $48,500, another for $49,200, a third for $49,900. It was a textbook, elementary technique known in forensic auditing circles as structuring. Someone on the inside with high-level clearance was deliberately chopping up massive, fraudulent withdrawals into bite-sized, unflagged pieces, slipping them quietly past the distracted gatekeepers. I did not immediately blow the whistle. A good risk assessor never presents a symptom to the board without first completely isolating the underlying disease. I needed to understand exactly who was directing the current moving through these hidden wires. The following Monday morning, I walked into the downtown corporate offices and found Vanessa standing alone in the sleek, modern executive kitchenette, aggressively stirring a cup of black coffee. I decided to apply a very small amount of conversational pressure to see how the carefully built structure reacted. I kept my tone entirely casual, adopting the unthreatening posture of someone merely doing mundane administrative housekeeping. I leaned against the doorframe and asked her a simple, direct question about the specific physical deliverables provided by Cedar Lane Staging and Ashmere Event Logistics, noting lightly that their submitted invoices lacked any itemized receipts for the materials they supposedly provided. The reaction I received was instantaneous and violently disproportionate. Vanessa did not offer a polite, corporate evasion or a promise to check her files. She physically recoiled, her hand jerking so hard that the ceramic coffee mug clattered loudly against the granite countertop, spilling hot liquid over the edge. The skin around her eyes tightened dangerously, and a sudden, furious, mottled flush crept up her neck. She spun around to face me, her voice dropping into a harsh, venomous hiss. She claimed they were highly specialized, secondary subcontractors handling sensitive promotional logistics for the upcoming real estate project, but her physical body language screamed sheer, unadulterated panic. Before I could even attempt to ask a single follow-up question, she stepped aggressively into my personal space, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. She told me, her voice dripping with absolute, unfiltered contempt, to stop acting like a damn cop in my own family, warning me that my sterile, interrogative nature was exactly why nobody in the inner circle truly trusted me. She stormed out of the kitchenette immediately after, leaving the bitter scent of burnt coffee and raw, palpable fear hanging heavy in the air. She genuinely thought her aggressive, dramatic outburst had effectively shut me down and put me in my place. In reality, she had just handed me the master key to the cipher. Honest people do not explode into defensive rage when asked for a standard business receipt. I returned to my desk, closed the corporate accounts, and completely shifted my investigative parameters. I stopped looking at the business and started looking deeply at Vanessa's personal trajectory. For the past 5 years, she had been the sole owner and operator of Juniper House Events, a boutique event planning firm that aggressively catered to the ultra-wealthy elite of the city. She loved the grand title, the glamorous magazine photo shoots, and the curated illusion of being a fiercely independent, self-made entrepreneur. But the quiet industry whispers and vendor credit reports told a starkly different, much darker story. Juniper House was bleeding out on the operating table. She had massively over-leveraged her business credit, alienated her most vital key suppliers with chronic, severely delayed payments, and was desperately trying to maintain a lavish personal lifestyle her failing business could no longer mathematically support. I took the timeline of her company's financial downward spiral and overlaid it directly on top of the phantom vendor payments silently draining out of her father's company. The two sets of data matched with terrifying, perfect symmetry. Every single time Juniper House hit a critical, catastrophic cash flow crisis, a sudden, $49,000 payment would miraculously clear the Hughes Accounts Payable Department under the fabricated guise of Blue Harbor Design Services. Funds were quietly disappearing from the secure family vault at the very moment Vanessa was sinking deeper into the crushing debt she had created for herself. That evening, Ethan and I sat together in our dimly lit living room. The house was perfectly quiet, the only sound the soft, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock out in the hallway. I carefully and methodically outlined my preliminary findings to him. I did not hurl wild accusations. I simply laid out the undeniable pattern of the numbers, the structural reality of the phantom vendors, and Vanessa's highly aggressive, panicked reaction in the corporate kitchenette. I needed my husband to see the thick, black smoke before the entire foundation of his family's house caught fire. Ethan listened patiently, staring down at his hands, his brow deeply furrowed in uncomfortable, resistant thought. But when he finally spoke, his words physically knocked the wind completely out of my lungs. He did not express outrage. He did not express deep concern for his father's vulnerable life's work. He simply reached across the sofa, gently took my hand, and offered a soft, deeply dismissive sigh. He told me I was looking at things far too rigidly. He argued passionately that Vanessa was just under a tremendous amount of immense personal stress with her struggling business, and that the highly disorganized invoices were likely just an indicator of sloppy bookkeeping, not a malicious, orchestrated conspiracy. He gently, almost pleadingly, urged me not to be so harsh on his younger sister, begging me to remember that family operated in a complex, emotional gray area that my rigid spreadsheets could not always neatly quantify. He was asking me to willfully, intentionally ignore a gaping, infected wound. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or scream in frustration. I just slowly pulled my hand away from his grasp, a profound, aching sadness settling incredibly heavy in the center of my chest. It was not burning anger that I felt toward my husband in that defining moment. It was a deep, chilling, entirely isolating grief. I realized right then that he was fundamentally, psychologically incapable of seeing the desperate predator living inside his own house. And even worse, his blind, unwavering sibling loyalty was providing her with the exact, perfect camouflage she desperately needed to keep stealing in the dark. I had no concrete, legally undeniable proof to bring to Robert just yet. The digital paper trail was still too intentionally murky, the stolen money washed too carefully through secondary, untraceable shell accounts. But from that specific Tuesday afternoon forward, the entire underlying architecture of my relationship with Vanessa permanently and irreversibly altered. The petty, passive-aggressive remarks at mandatory Sunday dinners, the subtle, engineered exclusions from family photos, the polite, frozen smiles across crowded rooms, none of it was merely a personal personality clash anymore. Vanessa knew that I knew. I had gently tapped my knuckles against the false wall, hiding her darkest, most desperate secret. I was no longer just the cold, analytical sister-in-law she simply disliked on a personal level. I had unwittingly become an existential, lethal threat to her very survival. The conflict had officially and permanently escalated far beyond a petty domestic dispute over family dynamics. It had mutated into a silent, brutal war of attrition between a desperate woman entirely willing to burn her family's legacy to the ground to hide her stolen money, and the one person in the room who absolutely fundamentally refused to close her eyes and pretend the fire did not exist. Exactly 7 days before the anniversary party, the invisible tripwires I did not even know I possessed began to snap. It started with a whisper, not a scream. I was sitting at my kitchen island on a quiet Tuesday morning, sipping a cup of green tea, when my mobile phone buzzed against the granite countertop. It was an automated security alert from my cloud storage provider. The message was sterile and brief, informing me that my encrypted message backup had just been successfully downloaded onto an unrecognized tablet device. Most people would dismiss it as a system glitch or a forgotten login from an old device. I do not have the luxury of that kind of blind optimism. I immediately checked the timestamp. It had occurred exactly 20 minutes earlier. I was home alone. Ethan had left for the corporate office at 7 o'clock sharp. A cold, creeping sensation washed over the back of my neck. I stood up and walked down the hallway to my private home office. The room looked perfectly normal at first glance. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the plantation shutters, but as I approached my heavy oak desk, my eyes caught a microscopic dissonance. The bottom right drawer, the one where I keep my physical hard drives and tax documents, was pushed in, but the brass handle was slightly misaligned with the frame above it. It was resting maybe 1/8 of an inch off its usual track. I am a woman who aligns her pens parallel to her keyboard. I never close a drawer haphazardly. Someone had been inside this room. Someone had opened that drawer in a frantic hurry and failed to close it with the required precision. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the absolute silence of the house. The violation was entirely silent, yet completely deafening. I did not touch the drawer. I turned around and walked out, locking the door behind me. The second confirmation arrived the following evening. I was sitting on the living room sofa, scrolling through my personal email inbox, when a new message populated at the very top. It was an automated confirmation from a boutique luxury hotel located squarely in the downtown arts district. The subject line cheerily thanked me for my reservation for the upcoming Friday night. I opened the email. The booking was made entirely in my name. The contact number listed was my personal cell phone, but when I scrolled down to the billing section, The payment method was listed as an anonymous electronic gift card. No credit card numbers, no traceable bank routing information, just a phantom payment for a room I never booked. A lesser person would have immediately dialed emergency services or frantically called their husband. I did neither. The local authorities are highly equipped to handle a shattered window or a stolen television, but they are entirely useless when an invisible entity is meticulously attempting to steal your reality. And I could not call Ethan. As much as it broke my heart, I knew he would try to rationalize it. He would suggest identity theft, a random internet scam, or a simple clerical error by the hotel. He would look for any possible excuse to avoid the terrifying truth that the threat was coming from inside his own family. Instead of panicking, I picked up my phone and dialed the only person I trusted to navigate the dark, complicated labyrinth of digital espionage. I called Mara Kessler. Mara is my oldest and closest friend. She is also a highly sought-after freelance digital forensics expert. She spends her life dissecting the digital footprints people desperately try to erase. She understands better than anyone on Earth how easily a person's life can be entirely fabricated using a mixture of genuine data and malicious intent. Mara arrived at my house less than 2 hours later, hauling a heavy black canvas bag filled with specialized diagnostic equipment. We sat at the dining room table, the same table where I had discovered the financial anomalies in the Hughes corporate ledger just months prior. I showed her the security alert and the phantom hotel reservation. I told her about the misaligned drawer. She did not offer me empty platitudes. She immediately plugged her specialized laptop into my home network router and began hunting for the digital breach. Within 45 minutes, she confirmed my worst fears. She found the unauthorized access logs. Someone had indeed piggybacked onto our home wireless network and systematically cloned my entire messaging history. You are not dealing with a random hacker. Lucy, Mara told me, her voice low and serious as her eyes scanned the rapidly scrolling lines of code on her screen. This is highly targeted. They are not trying to drain your bank accounts. They are harvesting your personal narrative. They want your schedule, your location pings, and your casual conversations. I need to know what they are building, I said, leaning back in my chair, and I need someone who can look at the financial side of the Hughes empire without triggering any internal alarms. I have found the bleeding, but I cannot legally request the raw banking data to prove who is holding the knife. Mara nodded slowly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black business card. I know exactly who you need, she said, sliding the card across the wooden table. His name is Gavin Pike. He is a senior forensic auditor at Ironclad Review Partners. We have collaborated on several highly classified corporate espionage cases. He is brilliant. He is ruthless. And most importantly, he has absolutely zero ties to the Hughes family or their vast network of influence. I arranged a meeting with Gavin the very next afternoon. We met in a quiet, incredibly discreet coffee shop located 3 towns over, far away from the prying eyes of the Charlotte corporate elite. Gavin was exactly as Mara described him. Sharp, meticulously dressed, and intensely observant. I laid out the entire situation for him, from the phantom vendor payments draining the family business to the sudden, terrifying digital attacks on my personal life. He listened in absolute silence, absorbing the complex web of information without interrupting. When I finally finished, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the small circular table. They are constructing a parallel reality, Gavin explained, his voice a calm, analytical murmur. The financial embezzlement you discovered is the motive. The digital intrusion is the weapon. They know you are the only obstacle standing between them and the final approval of the massive real estate deal next week. They cannot physically remove you, so they have to completely annihilate your credibility. It was in that exact moment, sitting across from a man I had known for exactly 30 minutes, that the entire, hideous shape of the conspiracy crystallized in my mind. They were going to frame me. They were going to take my innocent, everyday actions, a late night at the office, a vague text message to a friend, a perfectly normal business meeting, and violently twist them out of context. They were going to build a story so overwhelmingly convincing, so loaded with fabricated proof, that even my own husband would have no choice but to believe it. The bitter, crushing irony of the situation did not escape me. This purely professional, sterile alliance I was forming with Gavin to save the Hughes family legacy was the exact weapon Vanessa would eventually try to use to destroy my marriage. She was going to cast this brilliant forensic auditor as my illicit lover. "We need to lock down all your accounts immediately," Mara suggested over a secure conference call later that evening. "We need to change every password, implement physical security keys, and wipe the cloned data from their access points." "No," I said. The word hung in the air, cold and absolute. Both Mara and Gavin fell silent on the other end of the line. "If we lock the doors right now," I explained, pacing slowly across my living room floor, "we simply force them to find another, more destructive way inside. They are desperate. Desperate people do not stop when they hit a wall. They just grab a heavier hammer. We do not know the full extent of their plan yet. If we cut off their supply of information, they might accelerate their timeline before we are fully prepared to counterattack." "So what do you suggest we do?" Gavin asked, his tone laced with genuine curiosity. "We do not hide," I replied, staring out the window into the dark, quiet suburban street. "We give them exactly what they want. We give them a story." Instead of retreating into a defensive posture, I made the conscious, terrifying decision to turn my own life into a trap. If Vanessa wanted to play the role of a righteous investigator uncovering a sordid affair, I was going to gladly provide her with the very clues that would ultimately lead to her own public execution. Over the next 4 days, I meticulously crafted a trail of digital breadcrumbs. I deliberately left my phone unlocked on the kitchen counter when I knew Vanessa was dropping by to visit Ethan. I drafted an incredibly vague, emotionally ambiguous email and purposely left it sitting in my unsent folder, knowing her monitoring software would immediately capture it. I spoke in hushed tones on my phone when I knew someone was lingering in the hallway, but the final, most crucial piece of bait was the calendar appointment. I opened my digital schedule, which I knew she was actively mirroring, and created a new event for Friday evening. I titled it simply, "Private Meeting." I tagged the location as the exact same downtown boutique hotel where the phantom reservation had been made, and finally, I added a single, solitary name to the guest list: Gavin Pike. I was willingly handing them a loaded gun, fully aware that they intended to aim it directly at my head. But what Vanessa completely failed to realize in her arrogant, frantic rush to destroy me was that I had already quietly removed all the real bullets. I was ready for the party. Mara called me on a heavily encrypted line late on a Thursday evening. She had spent the last 48 hours meticulously untangling the chaotic web of routing protocols and digital handshakes connected to the unauthorized download of my private data. She did not find a faceless, offshore mercenary hiding behind a dozen proxy servers. She found something much closer to home, something profoundly domestic and entirely terrifying. The digital signature belonged to an older generation tablet that had quietly linked to our secured home wireless network. By cross-referencing the device access logs with my personal calendar, the timeline snapped into sharp, undeniable focus. The connection was established precisely during a sprawling Sunday brunch we had hosted for the extended family exactly 3 weeks prior. Knowing the digital point of entry was only half the battle. I needed to understand the physical mechanics of the intrusion into my private office. The misaligned drawer was not a ghost story. It was a physical mistake made by a panicked human being. The following morning, under the guise of an early neighborhood walk, I crossed the street to speak with Mr. Harrison. He is a retired aerospace engineer who maintains an excessively elaborate, high-definition security camera system angled toward his front lawn, a system that conveniently captures a completely unobstructed view of our driveway. I casually mentioned a minor concern about a misplaced package and asked if I could quickly review his exterior footage from that specific Sunday morning. He gladly obliged. We sat in his study, watching the recorded video feed. There it was, playing out in silent, undeniable clarity. A full 45 minutes before the rest of the invited relatives began to arrive, A familiar silver luxury sedan pulled smoothly into my driveway. Vanessa stepped out of the vehicle. She did not ring the doorbell. Instead, she walked directly to the heavy ceramic planter resting near the side entrance, retrieved the emergency spare key, and let herself inside. She was alone in my home for nearly an hour, possessing entirely unrestricted, unmonitored access to my private workspace while I was out picking up fresh pastries from the bakery. While Mara locked down the digital perimeter, Gavin plunged headfirst into the murky, heavily guarded financial abyss of the Hughes family empire. 2 days later, we met again at the same discreet coffee shop on the outskirts of the city. He did not bring a laptop. He brought a thick, heavily bound physical folder and slid it silently across the small wooden table. He had successfully mapped the subterranean flow of the stolen capital. Gavin had bypassed the superficial vendor invoices I originally found and dug directly into the clearinghouse routing numbers. The money was bleeding out of the primary corporate development accounts, flowing steadily into the hollow. Fabricated shell companies like Cedar Lane Staging and Blue Harbor Design. But those companies were merely temporary holding pens. From there, the capital was immediately wired through a secondary, highly obscured commercial intermediary, before finally washing into a heavily leveraged operating account strictly registered under the corporate umbrella of Juniper House Events. The financial loop was entirely closed. Vanessa was the sole, undeniable beneficiary of the stolen corporate funds. But as I stared at the intricate flowcharts Gavin had drawn, a glaring, insurmountable logistical problem emerged. Vanessa did not hold an executive title at her father's company. She possessed absolutely no internal administrative clearance to authorize external vendor payments exceeding a few $100s, let alone a continuous, coordinated drain of tens of thousands. She was merely the recipient. She could not possibly be the architect. She needed an accomplice on the inside, someone who held the master keys to the financial kingdom and commanded absolute, unquestioned trust. I flipped to the final, heavily redacted page of Gavin's dossier. My eyes scanned down to the bottom of the authorized payment vouchers. There, printed in stark, undeniable black ink, was the signature line approving the fraudulent transfers. It was not Robert Hughes. It was not my husband. It was Preston Vale. A sudden, freezing wave of nausea washed over me. Preston was the highly esteemed, fiercely independent senior accountant who had meticulously managed the Hughes family's private wealth and corporate taxes for over 15 years. He was an institution within their inner circle. He was practically a surrogate uncle to my husband. He had attended our wedding, drank our expensive wine, and offered us financial advice over countless holiday dinners. And for months, he had been quietly, systematically bleeding his closest, most loyal clients dry, carefully splitting the illegal spoils with a desperate, failing event planner. The sheer, breathtaking scale of their conspiracy finally locked into place, forming a terrifying, perfect picture. This was never simply about a petty, vindictive sister-in-law attempting to orchestrate a messy domestic dispute to ruin a marriage she disliked. This was a highly sophisticated, ruthlessly calculated preemptive strike against a corporate auditor. I instantly understood their master strategy. In less than a week, I was scheduled to walk into the primary boardroom and officially submit my independent risk assessment for the massive real estate acquisition. If I stood at the head of that table and presented objective evidence accusing Preston and Vanessa of massive financial embezzlement, they had to ensure the board would immediately dismiss my findings. To do that, they needed to entirely annihilate my moral and professional authority. If they could publicly expose me as a disgraced, deceitful woman engaged in a sickening secret affair, any financial warnings I issued would look exactly like the wild, fabricated retaliations of a cornered, vindictive liar desperately trying to deflect from her own ruined personal life. By destroying the auditor, they permanently buried the audit. The heaviest, most agonizing burden of this entirely silent war was carrying the radioactive weight of the truth alone inside my own marriage. Ethan remained completely, blissfully oblivious to the vicious wolves circling his family's legacy. Every single evening, we sat across from each other at the dining room table. The physical distance between us was merely a few feet, but the unspoken emotional chasm was growing wider and deeper by the hour. I desperately wanted to tell him. Every time I looked at his kind, trusting face, every time he asked me about my day, the urge to lay the investigative folders on the table and let him see the absolute truth clawed at my throat. But I knew his predictable, deeply ingrained familial loyalty better than I knew my own heartbeat. If I showed him the evidence prematurely, before the trap was fully set, he would not keep quiet. He would immediately, furiously confront Preston in his office. He would demand a tearful explanation from his sister, and the very second he tipped our hand, Preston and Vanessa would instantly panic. They would torch the remaining financial evidence, wipe the offshore servers entirely clean, and vanish the stolen money into untouchable, untraceable international accounts. To save him from total, devastating ruin, I had to willingly let him believe the absolute worst about me. I had to let him watch me become uncharacteristically secretive. I guarded my phone. I gave vague, evasive answers about my late working hours. I allowed the heavy, suffocating silence to build in our home, accepting the role of the distant, distracted wife. I watched the profound confusion and quiet hurt slowly pool in his eyes day after day, and I swallowed the agonizing pain of it like broken glass, knowing that protecting our future required sacrificing the peace of our present. I made a silent, ironclad vow in the dark of my home office. I would not confront them in the shadows. I would not fight a messy, localized skirmish behind closed doors that they could easily spin, manipulate, or completely deny. I would wait. I would wait for the exact, perfect moment when Vanessa felt the most invincible, the most untouchable. Because a predator who is absolutely drunk on the brilliance of their own perceived victory always makes the fatal, arrogant mistake of talking far too much in front of a captive audience. I would let her construct her grand public downfall right in the center of our living room, completely unaware that she was carefully, eagerly setting the stage for her own ruin. The heavy, calculating silence in our living room was suddenly and violently shattered by Vanessa. She had felt the atmospheric pressure of the room fundamentally shift. She realized her true, underlying corporate motive had been dangerously exposed to the board members present. So she desperately dragged the massive spotlight back to the messy, bleeding, emotional core of the room. She pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger directly at my husband. "Ethan deserves to be saved from a completely fake marriage," she shouted, her voice shrill and echoing harshly against the vaulted ceilings. She turned her back to the crowd, aggressively swiping her thumb across her phone screen to cast a new batch of digital venom onto the 85-inch television mounted above the fireplace. "Look at what she does when you are not looking," Vanessa demanded. A scanned, high-definition copy of a hotel folio materialized on the screen, dominating the room. It was the exact same boutique hotel reservation I had received a strange email about 7 days prior. The one secretly paid for with an untraceable electronic gift card. Then, with another violent swipe, the screen shifted. It displayed a photograph of a delicate, incredibly expensive diamond tennis bracelet resting on a dark velvet display cushion. Finally, she projected a massive snapshot of my digital work calendar from 2 weeks ago, aggressively highlighting a block of time marked out from 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock at night for a late strategy session. "She told you she was at the downtown office preparing for the merger," Vanessa sneered, turning back to face the captive audience. "But the metadata on her own files puts her exactly 2 blocks away from that hotel. And that diamond bracelet? It was purchased the very next morning from a private jeweler located directly across the street from Gavin Pike's accounting firm. She is not just cheating on you, Ethan. She is making a complete, absolute fool out of you while you pay for the roof over her head." I stood perfectly still, letting my eyes track over the towering projection. It was a masterful, sickeningly precise display of digital manipulation. Every single piece of data displayed up there possessed a tiny, microscopic grain of absolute truth, entirely severed from its original, innocent context and violently stitched together to form a monster. The hotel receipt was a real document generated by the hotel system, but I had never stepped foot inside their lobby. The calendar block was a genuine entry on my personal device, but it was the exact night I had met with Mara in my own dining room to secure my compromised wireless network. The photograph of the diamond bracelet was an image I had saved to a hidden folder on my phone 4 months ago, fully intending to show Ethan an idea for a milestone anniversary gift. They had crawled through the most private, mundane corners of my digital life and weaponized my own innocent memories against me. The large crowd of guests was completely captivated by the grotesque spectacle. But all the ambient noise, all the gasping and the frantic, hushed whispering, entirely faded into a total, ringing silence when Ethan finally spoke. He took one slow, heavy step forward, placing his body directly between me and the glowing television screen. He did not look at his sister. He looked down at me. The absolute, unwavering adoration that usually warmed his dark eyes had been entirely hollowed out, replaced by a devastating, raw vulnerability that physically hurt to witness. "Who is Gavin Pike?" Ethan asked. The 5 words were spoken softly, barely above a raspy whisper, but they hit me with the kinetic force of a swinging hammer. The true, suffocating agony of that specific moment did not come from the public humiliation or the fact that 30 people were currently recording my face. The pain was entirely anchored in the subtle, terrifying shift in my husband's tone. It was the desperate, pleading voice of a man who no longer believed his wife was incapable of destroying him. He was asking for the truth, but the broken geometry of his posture told me he had already accepted the lie as reality. I felt a sharp, violent ache behind my ribs, a desperate, overwhelming urge to reach out, to grab his hands and pour out the entire, complicated truth right there on the hardwood floor. I wanted to tell him about the forensic audit, the phantom vendors, the stolen corporate money, and the elaborate trap I had been forced to build, but I looked past his broad shoulder. I saw Preston Vale standing near the edge of the darkened hallway, his face completely devoid of all expression, his eyes darting nervously toward the heavy oak front door. If I broke protocol now, if I laid my investigative cards on the table simply to soothe my husband's broken heart, Preston would quietly slip out into the night. By sunrise, the offshore servers would be wiped clean, and the stolen millions would vanish into untouchable international accounts. I swallowed the heavy knot of grief forming in my throat, met Ethan's fractured gaze, and forced my voice to remain perfectly, rigidly steady. He is a real person. I said, Gavin Pike is real. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept violently through the living room. It sounded like the air being sucked out of a vacuum chamber. Diane, sitting in her armchair, dug her fingernails so deeply into the upholstery I thought the fabric might tear. Ethan physically flinched, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch, as if I had just struck him hard across the jaw. But, I continued, deliberately projecting my voice so it carried clearly over the sudden, rising wave of shocked murmurs. My relationship with him is absolutely nothing like the fabricated fairy tale your sister is currently projecting onto our wall. It was a highly dangerous, half-open answer, and I knew it the second the words left my mouth. It confirmed the physical existence of the phantom lover without completely explaining his actual purpose, leaving a massive, highly combustible void of ambiguity suspended heavily in the air between us. Vanessa lunged at that exact ambiguity with the desperate, blind hunger of a starving predator. She spun away from the television, turning her aggressive attention directly toward Robert Hughes, who was standing frozen near the edge of the mahogany dining table. "Do you hear her?" Vanessa demanded, her voice cracking perfectly with manufactured, hysterical outrage. She is not even denying that he exists. She is playing twisted word games while she actively destroys my brother. She took a deep, dramatic breath, forcibly shifting her physical posture to look entirely solemn, practical, and highly professional. "Dad, Ethan, you cannot possibly allow her to represent this family tomorrow morning," Vanessa pleaded, waving her hand toward the television screen. "You cannot let a woman with zero moral compass, a woman who has been actively, maliciously lying to your faces for months, hold the final, binding signature on a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. Her judgment is completely compromised, She is a massive liability. She needs to be legally removed from the signing schedule immediately. The atmosphere in the room crystallized into pure ice. The heavy emotional fog of the messy marital dispute instantly evaporated, leaving behind a stark, glaringly obvious corporate battlefield. Several of the senior business partners standing near the back of the room stopped whispering. They exchanged sharp, highly calculating glances. The actual terrifying objective of the night was no longer successfully hidden behind the flimsy guise of a protective, heartbroken sister. This was never a rescue mission for Ethan's heart. It was a targeted, ruthless assassination of my professional authority. She was aggressively demanding my head on a silver platter, and the price she was entirely willing to pay to secure her stolen money was the total destruction of my marriage. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her demand was almost impressive. She was standing in the center of my home, drinking my expensive wine, aggressively trying to fire me from my own corporate contract to protect the massive fortune she was secretly stealing from her own father. I refused to argue on her terms. Instead of feeding the spectacle, I let my silence and composure do the work. I simply reached out and picked up my crystal wine glass from the table, taking a very slow, highly deliberate sip of the dark red liquid. The absolute, unbothered calm of my physical movements was a stark, jarring contrast to the frantic, screaming energy she was radiating across the room. I slowly lowered the heavy glass and looked directly into her wide eyes. The manic, victorious fire burning fiercely in her expression suddenly flickered and dimmed. "You are in much more of a hurry," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, conversational tone that cut through the ambient noise of the room like a freshly sharpened scalpel, than someone who is simply feeling betrayed on behalf of her brother should be. I did not wait for Vanessa to recover from my comment. While her mouth was still open, struggling to form a coherent defense against the sudden shift in my tone, I reached into the deep pocket of my blazer. I pulled out a sleek black remote control. It was not the standard television remote Ethan had used moments ago. It was a dedicated presentation clicker, synced to a hidden, encrypted microcomputer I had personally hardwired into the back of our entertainment system earlier that afternoon. I pressed the input toggle button. The 85-inch screen flickered, instantly severing the wireless connection to Vanessa's phone. Her fabricated, highly curated mosaic of lies vanished into a momentary sea of black glass. A second later, my own secure directory illuminated the living room. "What are you doing?" Vanessa snapped, her voice pitching upward in genuine alarm as she tapped frantically at her frozen mobile screen. "Turn it back." "You do not get to shut this down." "I am not shutting anything down," I replied smoothly, aiming the clicker at the screen. "I am simply expanding the frame. You have shown everyone your highly creative editing skills. Now, it is time for the raw, unedited footage." I clicked the right arrow. A high-definition video file immediately began to play. It was the exact same dimly lit boutique hotel lobby from Vanessa's damning photograph, captured by the facility's own high-resolution security cameras. The timestamp in the corner read exactly 8 o'clock in the evening from 2 weeks prior. There I was, walking through the ornate brass doors. The entire room held its collective breath, anticipating the scandalous arrival of my supposed lover. Gavin Pike walked into the frame a moment later, but he did not reach for my hand. He did not lean in for a clandestine, illicit embrace. Instead, he formally shook my hand, and then turned to greet a third person who had been entirely cropped out of Vanessa's version of reality. A distinguished silver-haired woman in a sharp navy blue suit stepped into the center of the camera's view. She carried a thick leather briefcase and carried herself with the unmistakable, rigid posture of an institutional banker. "For those in the room who do not recognize her," I announced, projecting my voice clearly over the sudden, confused whispering erupting among the guests, "that is Eleanor Vance. She is the Senior Vice President of Risk Management for the Primary Lending Consortium underwriting the Hughes Meridian development deal." Gavin and I were not meeting for a romantic rendezvous. We were conducting a highly confidential, late-night preliminary review of the loan covenants with the bank's chief representative to ensure tomorrow morning's signing would proceed without a catastrophic failure. The visual proof was absolute and entirely undeniable. The scandalous, shadowy image of a cheating wife sneaking into a hotel had been surgically decapitated, intentionally removing the senior bank executive to weaponize a mundane, incredibly boring corporate compliance meeting. I did not give the crowd time to fully process the deception before I clicked the remote again. The video vanished, replaced by the full, unredacted text of the email Vanessa had so proudly paraded around minutes earlier. "You all saw the single sentence Vanessa highlighted," I said, pacing slowly across the rug, owning the center of the room. "You are the only person I can talk to in private." It sounds incredibly damning when it is violently ripped from its surrounding paragraph. But let us read the entire thought, shall we? I pressed a button, and a bright yellow highlight box expanded across the towering block of text. The paragraph read clearly, "The internal financial discrepancies I have located within the Hughes operational ledgers are severe and deeply systemic. Someone with high-level clearance is actively draining capital using phantom vendor accounts. Until I can definitively prove who is authorizing these fraudulent wire transfers, I cannot bring this to Robert or Ethan. You are the only person I can talk to in private about this audit without triggering an internal panic." The atmospheric shift in the living room was violent and immediate. The collective shock of the alleged infidelity was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp wave of corporate terror. The uncles, the senior partners, and the legal advisors physically stepped closer to the screen, their eyes frantically scanning the words "internal financial discrepancies" and "phantom vendor accounts." The very foundation of the multi-million-dollar empire they relied upon was suddenly in question. Robert Hughes's face drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just been informed his entire house was built over a massive sinkhole. He turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze locking onto his daughter. Vanessa panicked. The structural integrity of her elaborate, carefully constructed lie was collapsing in real time. She frantically waved her hands, trying to physically block the massive screen behind her. "It does not matter," she screamed, her voice cracking under the immense, crushing weight of her own exposure. "She is still lying. Even if she was working, she could still be sleeping with him. She is a manipulator. She is trying to confuse you with corporate jargon so you ignore the fact that she is a cheating, deceitful snake." It was a pathetic, desperately flailing defense, and the entire room knew it. The crowd, which had been so eager to consume my downfall just 10 minutes ago, was now looking at Vanessa with deep, unfiltered suspicion. They recognized the frantic, unhinged energy of a cornered animal. But before Vanessa could dig her grave any deeper, a new voice violently entered the fray. "This is completely unacceptable." The voice was deep, authoritative, and dripping with righteous indignation. Preston Vale pushed his way through the cluster of stunned relatives, stepping squarely into the illuminated space between me and the television. His tailored suit looked slightly rumpled, and a thin, highly uncharacteristic layer of sweat glistened on his forehead. He turned his back to me and addressed Ethan and Robert directly, adopting the protective, paternal tone he had utilized for over a decade to manage the family's wealth. "Are we simply going to ignore what she just admitted on that screen?" Preston demanded, gesturing aggressively toward the email projection. "She just confessed, in front of this entire room, that she has been secretly, unlawfully investigating this family's private financial records behind her own husband's back. She hired an outside forensic auditor without any executive authorization. She has been treating this family, the very people who welcomed her into their home, like a syndicate of common criminals. He was good. He was incredibly good. In a matter of seconds, Preston had seamlessly grabbed the dying narrative and violently twisted it in a brand new direction. He was actively trying to reframe my attempt to save the company as an act of massive, unforgivable domestic betrayal. He was trying to make my loyalty look like treason. "This is exactly why we cannot trust her signature on the merger documents tomorrow," Preston continued, his voice rising in volume, building a false crescendo of moral outrage. "She is paranoid, she is invasive, and she operates entirely in the shadows. We have no idea what other fabricated evidence she has concocted to ruin this family's reputation. The room wavered again. The older relatives, deeply conditioned to trust Preston's steady hand on the financial wheel, began to nod slowly. The confusion was thick and suffocating. They did not know who to believe anymore. I stood silent, watching Preston's desperate performance. He was fighting for his absolute life, and he did not even realize he had just made a fatal, irreversible tactical error. By jumping into the fire to save Vanessa, by desperately trying to pivot the conversation away from the stolen money and back onto my supposed moral failings, he had prematurely exposed his own profound panic. I had barely scratched the surface of the financial embezzlement, and the senior accountant was already sweating through his expensive shirt, desperately trying to silence me. I knew I had hit the exact, exposed nerve connecting them both. I could have ended it right then. I had the bank routing numbers, the unauthorized signature logs, and the definitive proof of the shell companies sitting in the next hidden folder on my secure server. I could have completely cleared my name of the sordid affair and walked away with my professional dignity entirely intact, but simply clearing my name was never the ultimate goal. If I played my final card right now, while the room was still chaotic and emotionally volatile, Preston and Vanessa would find a tiny, microscopic loophole. They would blame a clerical error, a misunderstood verbal directive, or a complex tax strategy. They would muddy the waters just enough to survive the night. I needed to completely, unequivocally bury their escape routes. I needed to ensure that when the final, devastating truth was revealed, there would be absolutely no room for interpretation, no possibility of a slick, corporate defense, and no safe harbor left for them to run toward. I needed to let them confidently lock the door to their own prison cell before I handed over the keys to the warden. So I held my finger perfectly still over the presentation remote, letting Preston's accusations echo loudly into the high ceiling, waiting for the absolute, perfect silence to fall before I delivered the final, fatal blow. I let Preston's desperate, heavy breathing fill the silent living room for a few agonizing seconds. He stood there, his chest heaving under his expensive suit, waiting for me to engage in a chaotic, defensive shouting match. Instead, I simply pressed the center button on my presentation clicker. The towering projection of my email vanished, replaced immediately by a stark, minimalist screen displaying a single horizontal audio waveform. You are a phenomenal orator when you are backed into a corner. Preston, I stated, my voice entirely devoid of anger. But you made a catastrophic error when you chose your accomplice. When Vanessa illegally synced her older generation tablet to my home wireless network to clone my private messages, she neglected to disable the automatic cloud backup features on her own device. My forensic expert did not just recover the stolen data you intended to use against me, she recovered the ambient audio logs recorded while the device was active in Vanessa's own living room. I pressed play. The crisp, undeniable sound of Vanessa's voice echoed through the high-end surround sound system of my home. It was not the hysterical, tearful pitch she had been using to feign heartbreak all night. It was sharp, cruel, and brutally pragmatic. It has to be at the anniversary party, the recorded voice of my sister-in-law insisted. If she is discredited tonight, her signature will be completely worthless by morning. The board will never accept an audit from a disgraced wife. They will throw her out, and the merger goes through without her looking at the final vendor ledgers. Then, another voice responded on the recording. A deep, familiar, highly respected voice. Just ensure the digital trail points away from the corporate accounts. Preston's recorded voice instructed coldly, make it entirely about her infidelity. If Ethan kicks her out, we have unrestricted access to the escrow funds by Monday. The audio file clicked off, leaving a deafening, toxic silence in its wake. I turned my head to look at my husband. Ethan was staring at his younger sister, as if the flesh had suddenly melted from her bones to reveal a terrifying, completely unrecognizable monster underneath. The agonizing confusion that had clouded his eyes just moments ago was gone, entirely replaced by a horrifying, hollow realization. For his entire life, he had protected her, excused her reckless financial behavior, and defended her vicious outbursts as the unavoidable byproduct of a sensitive, misunderstood soul. In that singular, devastating moment, the protective illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He finally saw her not as a jealous sibling acting out of misplaced love, but as a cold, calculating predator who had actively conspired to emotionally destroy him just to clear a secure path to a bank vault. Before anyone could utter a single word to break the tension, I clicked the remote again. The blank screen erupted into a massive, highly detailed financial flowchart. "Since we are finally discussing the real motive," I announced, stepping toward the illuminated screen to command the room's absolute attention, "let us look at the actual numbers." I pointed to the left side of the towering display. For the past 3 fiscal quarters, the Hughes Meridian development accounts have been systematically hemorrhaging capital, hundreds of thousands of dollars. The withdrawals were meticulously disguised under vague, unverified operational categories: event decoration, visual services, and media deposits. Every single transaction was mathematically engineered by your trusted senior accountant to sit exactly $1 below the mandatory executive review threshold. I clicked the remote, and bright red lines shot aggressively across the screen, connecting the initial withdrawals to a central hub. The funds flowed directly into shell companies, but they did not stop there. Preston routed the stolen capital through a secondary commercial intermediary to completely wash the corporate fingerprints off the money. Another click. The red lines converged onto a single, undeniable corporate logo on the far right side of the screen. "And the final destination," I said, letting the undeniable truth hang heavily over the crowd, "was the primary operating account of Juniper House Events. This entire, elaborate assassination attempt on my character was orchestrated simply because my risk assessment was going to expose the absolute fact that Vanessa has been funding her bankrupt lifestyle by draining her father's legacy, with Preston functioning as the highly paid gatekeeper." I looked directly over at Robert Hughes. The powerful patriarch looked as though he had physically aged 20 years in the span of 3 minutes. His face was a sickly, ashen gray. He was a brilliant businessman, and his sharp mind was already racing past the immediate family betrayal, running the catastrophic corporate math. He knew exactly what this meant. If he walked into the primary boardroom tomorrow morning and signed the binding agreements for the massive real estate acquisition using severely compromised, fraudulently inflated financial ledgers, the entire Hughes empire would face a catastrophic chain reaction collapse. The lending consortium would instantly pull their massive funding. The federal regulatory agencies would descend like vultures, and his life's work would be completely annihilated by a criminal indictment. "This is a complete fabrication," Preston roared, his meticulously crafted composure entirely disintegrating. The sophisticated, untouchable veneer of the senior advisor vanished, leaving behind a cornered, desperate thief. His face was flushed purple with rage and raw terror. "This is an illegal, unauthorized breach of private financial data. You cannot use this. I am leaving this house right now, and I am calling the authorities to report a severe cybercrime." He turned aggressively toward the front door, violently shoving past a stunned uncle, his heavy footsteps echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. "I would not bother calling anyone, Mr. Vale," a calm, clear voice called out from the back of the crowd. The stunned guests parted like the Red Sea. Mara Kessler, my oldest friend, stepped confidently out of the shadows. She had been standing quietly near the kitchen island for the entire evening, blending in perfectly as just another casually dressed friend invited to celebrate a marital milestone. She held up a sleek, silver data drive between her fingers. "My name is Mara Kessler," she announced to the silent room, her tone strictly professional and entirely unyielding. "I am a certified digital forensics investigator. And I can assure you, every single piece of data displayed on that screen tonight was legally obtained through defensive security protocols after an unauthorized device violently breached my client's home network." Preston froze in his tracks, his hand hovering mere inches from the brass doorknob. "Furthermore," Mara continued, taking a few deliberate steps forward so she was clearly visible to both Preston and Vanessa. You cannot simply walk out of here and erase the offshore servers. Exactly 2 hours before this party even began, I compiled the entire, unredacted dataset, including the audio recordings, the network access logs, and the complete financial routing history, and transmitted it via a secure encrypted tunnel to Lucy's civil litigation attorneys. The files are already locked in a secure legal vault. The fire is already completely out of your control. There is absolutely nothing left for you to burn. Preston's broad shoulders slumped. The remaining air completely left his lungs. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine and heard the unmistakable metallic click beneath his shoe. Vanessa, witnessing the total, irreversible destruction of her grand conspiracy, violently abandoned her aggressive posture. The sneering, triumphant accuser vanished in a fraction of a second. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the expensive Persian rug, burying her face in her hands, and began to sob hysterically. It was a chaotic, entirely desperate performance. I only did it because you ruined everything. Vanessa screamed through her manufactured tears, her voice echoing shrilly in the quiet room. She pointed a shaking finger at me, trying frantically to claw her way back to the familiar safety of victimhood. You took Ethan away from us. You came into this family and turned our entire home into a sterile, cold corporation. You made everything about ledgers and rules and audits. You isolated my brother. I just wanted my family back. I just wanted you gone so we could breathe again. She looked up at Ethan, her heavy mascara running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks, begging him with her wide eyes to remember the little sister he used to fiercely protect. I did not let Ethan answer her. I walked slowly around the mahogany dining table, stopping mere inches from where she knelt on the floor. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no anger, no vindication, and certainly no pity. I just felt a profound, incredibly heavy exhaustion. Do not insult the intelligence of everyone standing in this room by wrapping your profound greed in the sacred flag of family trauma. I told her, my voice echoing cold and hard against the stone fireplace. That is not the heartbreaking pain of an abandoned, neglected sister. That is the sheer, unadulterated panic of a thief who has suddenly realized that throwing a devastating grenade into her brother's marriage is no longer going to successfully hide her dirty money. Everything I have shown you so far. I began. Addressing the captivated, breathless room, my voice was entirely steady, echoing clearly off the high vaulted ceilings of our home. Everything you have witnessed up until this exact moment has merely dismantled the vicious, fictional narrative that was thrust upon me. I have shown you the raw security footage, the complete, unedited emails, and the actual context of a deeply boring corporate compliance review, but disproving a lie is only half of the equation. Now, I'm going to show you exactly who manufactured it, stroke by calculated stroke. I aimed the presentation remote at the massive screen and clicked the right directional button one final time. The complex financial flowcharts dissolved, immediately replaced by a stark, highly structured digital forensics report. It was the master document Mara had compiled, densely packed with device registry logs and time-stamped network handshakes. To the untrained eye, it looked like a wall of complicated code, but I had specifically asked her to highlight the indisputable conclusions in bright, undeniable crimson boxes. Let us revisit the scandalous text messages Vanessa so proudly displayed to you all 20 minutes ago. I instructed, pointing toward the upper left quadrant of the television. Those messages were never sent from my personal cellular device. As you can clearly read on the screen, the screenshots were generated using a digital user interface emulator. The software was downloaded onto a tablet registered under the personal account belonging to Vanessa Hughes. She literally texted herself from a burner application, formatted the screen to look exactly like my phone, and manually altered the displayed time to 11 o'clock at night. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd of relatives and business partners. The sheer, terrifying premeditation of the act was finally settling in. I moved my finger to the next crimson box. And the mysterious boutique hotel reservation? The one paid for with an untraceable electronic gift card to frame my supposed affair? The digital purchase receipt and the confirmation email routing data were completely recovered. The transaction did not originate from my office computer or my home network. The location data permanently attached to the fraudulent purchase traces directly back to the private wireless router located inside Vanessa's downtown apartment. Furthermore, the unauthorized digital access to my private photograph backups occurred precisely during the 1-hour window when Vanessa was physically present inside my home 3 weeks ago. Vanessa remained kneeling on the expensive Persian rug, her hands covering her face. She was completely, utterly trapped in the very spotlight she had so desperately demanded. But the most damning piece of physical evidence, I continued, my gaze shifting away from my sister-in-law and locking directly onto the pale, sweating face of Preston Vale, proves that this was never a solitary act of desperation. It was a perfectly synchronized, two-pronged assault. One branch was designed to annihilate my personal credibility, and the other branch was simultaneously deployed to permanently clear the path to the stolen money. I clicked the remote. The final document materialized. It was a physical security access log from the downtown corporate offices of the Hughes family enterprise. This is the electronic lock record for the master physical safe located in the executive accounting suite. I explained to the silent, horrified room. Exactly 12 hours after Vanessa illegally breached my home network to harvest my private calendar data, Preston Vale used his senior administrative keycard to open that vault. He physically removed the original, hard-copy payment vouchers for the fabricated vendors. He destroyed the paper trail precisely when Vanessa began building the digital smokescreen to blind us all. It was the absolute, indisputable kill shot. There were no more loopholes, no more plausible deniabilities, no more tearful appeals to family loyalty. The entire conspiracy was laid bare, illuminated in high definition for everyone to witness. The heavy, suffocating paralysis that had gripped my husband since the moment his sister first raised her wineglass finally shattered. Ethan did not say a word at first. He simply walked around the mahogany dining table, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He crossed the space dividing us and stopped directly beside me. He reached out and firmly grasped my left hand, interlacing his fingers tightly with mine. The warmth of his grip returned, anchoring me, a silent, powerful declaration to the entire room that the wedge Vanessa had tried to violently hammer between us had completely failed. Ethan looked down at his younger sister. The anger in his eyes was not explosive. It was an incredibly deep, freezing void of profound disappointment. The most terrifying part of all this, "Vanessa," Ethan said, his voice thick with a crushing, irreparable sorrow, "is not that you stole the money. If you were drowning in debt, if your business was truly failing, you could have come to me. You could have come to Dad. We would have helped you. But instead, you chose to steal from our family legacy, and when you were caught, you were perfectly willing to completely destroy my marriage, to break my heart into a million pieces in front of all our friends, just to cover your own tracks." Vanessa lowered her hands, looking up at her brother with a pathetic, pleading expression, but the words died in her throat. Robert Hughes stepped forward, his posture rigid, the commanding presence of the corporate patriarch returning in full force. He did not look at his daughter. He looked directly at the senior accountant, who had betrayed his trust for over a decade. "Preston," Robert said, his voice echoing with absolute, terrifying authority. "Your administrative access to every single corporate and private account associated with this family is permanently terminated as of this exact second. You are to surrender your keys, your company phone, and your access badges right now. Tomorrow morning, my legal team will be handing this entire forensic dossier over to the federal authorities." Diane, my mother-in-law, remained frozen in her velvet armchair. The color had completely drained from her face. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, crushing realization of her own complicity. She had sat there in total silence, perfectly willing to watch me be publicly slaughtered, choosing the comfort of her daughter's lie over the messy reality of my defense. She could not utter a single word. Vanessa slowly scrambled to her feet. Her expensive emerald silk dress wrinkled and stained with spilled wine. She tried to stammer out an explanation, a final desperate attempt to justify her actions. But the very evidence she had proudly brought into my home had transformed into the unbreakable chains locking her in a prison of her own making. The more public she had tried to make my humiliation, the more impossible it became for her to deny her own crimes. I did not celebrate. I did not insult her or demand an apology. The truth had already done enough damage on its own. I simply looked at her and delivered a final, absolute truth that I knew would haunt her for the rest of her life. You thought you were projecting my betrayal onto the screen tonight. Vanessa, I said, my tone chillingly calm. In reality, you were only projecting the truth of yourself. Vanessa Hughes turned around and walked out of my house in a heavy, suffocating silence. She did not say a single word. She just faded into the dark, quiet suburban night. Preston Vale did not follow her. He was immediately detained near the front door by Robert and two of the senior corporate legal advisors who had quickly stepped forward to ensure he did not attempt to flee. Ethan turned to me. He let go of my hand, only to reach down and pick up the ornate silver cake knife I had abandoned on the white lace runner nearly an hour ago. He looked at the beautiful, untouched 3-tier vanilla bean cake, and then he looked deeply into my eyes. Do you still want to continue this anniversary night? He asked softly, offering the silver handle of the knife to me. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around his hand, guiding the blade together. I looked at the chaotic, shattered remnants of the party, and then at my husband. Yes, I answered quietly. I did not say yes because the night was still perfect, or because the wounds would miraculously heal by tomorrow morning. I wanted to continue because, for the very first time in 9 long years, every single mask in the Hughes family had finally fallen, and everyone was standing exactly where they truly belonged. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Where are you currently tuning in from to listen to this video? Please leave a comment down below so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so that this story can be heard by even more people.